We are continuing our look at some of the heroes of the faith, and we're going to look at the second part of Joseph's story today. And I must admit that perhaps the last part of the sermon, I'm really preaching to me, and if you all can listen to it. But when we left Joseph last week, he was in prison for resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife. But God was with him in prison, and he was put in charge of running the prison. And during that time, two of Pharaoh's servants were put into prison, the baker and the carpenter, and each had a dream. And Joseph gave them the interpretation of their dreams, that the cupbearer would be restored to his place with Pharaoh, but the baker would be hanged. And Joseph asked the cupbearer to mention him to Pharaoh so that he could also get out of prison. Well, things happened just as Joseph had predicted, and through the interpretation that Joseph had given of the dreams. And of course, the cupbearer forgot his promises to Joseph until 2 years later when Pharaoh had two strange dreams. And the cupbearer remembered the Hebrew in prison who had interpreted his dream, and so he sent for Joseph. And Joseph was able to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. There were to be 7 years of plenty in the land, then followed by 7 years of famine. And since there had been two dreams, it meant that these things would come to pass. Then Joseph suggested a plan to Pharaoh, that he set an overseer over the land to gather 1/5 of the produce from the good years in the cities of Egypt, so that they would have food on reserve for the 7 years of famine. Well, that proposal pleased Pharaoh, and Joseph was chosen to be the overseer. So in one day, Joseph went from being in prison to being second in charge over all of Egypt. And things came to pass just as Joseph had predicted. And in the second year of the famine, Jacob, Joseph's father, hears that there is grain in Egypt. They had famine in their land also. So he sends 10 of his sons, but not Benjamin, to Egypt to buy grain. And as the Lord would have it, they arrived at the city where Joseph was. Now Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize their brother, for he looked like an Egyptian ruler. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had had about his brothers. So Joseph put his brothers through some very elaborate testing to see if they truly regretted and had repented of what they had done to him 20 years earlier when they sold him into slavery. And he saw that he had changed, and they confessed their wrongdoing, not realizing that they were confessing in front of their brother. Now Joseph did completely and truly forgive his brothers, because he recognized God's hand at work in him and through him and all that had happened. Now I'm going to read to you from Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of his attendants, so he declared, "Everyone leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians in Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 more years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him that this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all of Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I am speaking to you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all of his brothers and wept, embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. Here ends the reading of our lesson. May your word abide in us, O Lord. And now may the words of my mouth and may the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. The brothers were forgiven, and they returned to their father, and they brought Jacob to Egypt to be reunited with his son, and it was a wonderful reunion. And when it was near the time for Jacob to die, he gathered his sons around him to pronounce the final blessings on them. Years ago, I was leading a disciples' Bible study, and the weekly readings were from the last chapters of Genesis. And at that time, there was a woman at the healthcare center at Wesley Commons that was dying. And she had 2 daughters, and the daughters absolutely hated one another. Why, I never found out, and I don't think I really wanted to know. But the mother seemed to be lingering. And we had had several prayers throughout the day with many different people that were in the room. But late in the afternoon, it happened to be that just the 2 daughters and myself were in the room with her. And I asked if we could have prayer again. And as I was praying, I thought about Jacob's final blessing on his sons. And I prayed for God's blessing on her 2 daughters, acknowledging that she loved both of them, the unique person that each one was. Well, there was tears in everyone's eyes, and within 20 minutes, the mother's breathing changed, and she soon passed away. And I think she wanted both of her daughters to know that she loved them. And then it was shortly after that, there was another woman that was close to death, and I went to visit her, but she seemed to be unresponsive. But I noticed something in her room that I had not seen before. There was a picture of one of her granddaughters. Well, her granddaughter was my daughter's roommate at Clemson, and I had never made the connection. And although she seemed to be unresponsive, I told her that I knew her granddaughter, and I told her something that my daughter had told me that they had just recently done together. And when I prayed, I asked God to bless all of her family, each and every one, and to take care of them, and to protect them, and to keep them from all harm. And I prayed that they truly would come to know God's love. And I saw tears running down her face. A parent's blessing, a grandparent's blessing, a final blessing can be very powerful. Years ago, I attended a healing service at a chaplain's retreat at Lake Junaluska. And the chaplain that led that healing service shared the story of the first healing service that he had ever led. Somewhere, either in the service itself or in his preparation for it, he realized that he needed healing. He included a list of things that one might need healing for, and the last thing on the list was physical healing. But the very first thing on the list was an unforgiving heart. He had a son who had been a crack addict. He had caused his family all kinds of grief, put them all through all sorts of turmoil, had lied to them and had stolen from them. And I don't remember how, but either through treatment or a stay in the prison or both, but through the grace of God, the son had been healed of his addiction. But the chaplain did not trust that his son had been healed, and he kept waiting for him to return to his old ways. The father realized that his unforgiving heart needed healing, that he needed to forgive his son in order to free his son to live a healed life. I think that the chaplain realized that as long as he did not completely trust his son, in some subconscious way, the son could not totally trust himself. But they were both healed. Since then, I have seen this part of Joseph's story in a different light. I see it through the lens of that chaplain's story. I see things differently. And I'm about to interpret these events, perhaps contrary to the traditional interpretation, but hopefully not contrary to the heart of God. If you read Jacob's blessings, when Jacob blessed his sons, they were not favorable blessings. In a way, they sounded more like curses. And the blessings reflected who the sons were as young men, and perhaps not the men that they had become. If you read the whole saga of Joseph, you see that there were changes in Reuben and in Judah, and all the brothers confessed their guilt concerning Joseph. But Jacob, the father, sounded as if he may have needed healing for an unforgiving heart. I say that because his sons did not believe that they had truly been forgiven. After Jacob died, they were fearful that now Joseph would take time to get even. They did not trust. They could not believe that Joseph had forgiven them. They could not believe that God had forgiven them. Even though Joseph had told them repeatedly, "You meant it for evil. God meant it for good." How does this story fit into our salvation history? God sent Joseph ahead to Egypt to save his family. And then 400 years later, God would send Moses back to Egypt to save the Israelite nation from slavery. And then 2,000 years ago, God sent his son into the world to save us. And then later, John, the Apostle John, saw in his revelation, he saw Christ in heaven and sitting on his throne. And around the throne were 24 elders on 24 thrones. And in biblical imagery, 12 2 times is 24 is completeness. It represents all people. But in its most literal translation, the 12 thrones, the 12 elders represent the 12 thrones of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. And Jacob's 12 sons are also mentioned in another place in Revelation. And then the other 12 are the 12 apostles, Paul replacing Judas. But John's vision of heaven included them all. Sinners, all that they had been, but forgiven. Forgiven by Joseph and forgiven by God. We too are included in that number. We have been forgiven by God. Believe that. Trust that. Thanks be to God. Amen.